when this B-24 Liberator pilot shot down a Japanese plane with his pistol at 15,000 feet. Part 1. The Burning Fortress, March 31, 1943. The air over Burma was thick with humidity and the smell of high-octane fuel. Owen Baggett, a young American co-pilot, sat in the cockpit of a B-24 Liberator named the Crew's Second Chance. They were part of a small formation sent to destroy a strategic railroad bridge at Pinmana. The B-24 was a beast of a plane, 4 engines, a 10-man crew, and over 8,000 pounds of bombs. It was a flying fortress meant to dominate the sky. But as they approached the target at 15,000 feet, the sky didn't stay empty for long. Out of the sun came the Oscars. The Nakajima Ki-43, the Japanese Empire's most agile fighter. They didn't just attack, they swarmed. In seconds, the Liberator was no longer a hunter, it was the prey. The air was filled with tracers, the scream of engines, and the terrifying sound of lead tearing through aluminum. Owen Baggett was about to discover that when your world starts to burn, the only thing that matters is how you choose to go out. The death of a giant. The attack was surgical and brutal. The Japanese pilots focused on the bomber's fuel lines and engines. Within minutes, the B-24 was a torch. Fire began to lick the cockpit glass. The oxygen system was shattered. Owen Baggett and the pilot, Lloyd Jensen, fought the controls as the heavy bomber began a slow, agonizing roll toward the earth. The command came over the intercom, distorted by static and fear. "Bail out! Bail out!" Owen scrambled from his seat. The plane was filled with thick, black smoke. He could feel the heat through his flight suit. He reached for his parachute, clipped it to his chest, and dove into the open air. He was 15,000 feet above the jungle. The roar of the engines was gone, replaced by the terrifying whistle of the wind. But the nightmare was just beginning. The Predator in the canopy. As Owen and his crew dangled from their white silk parachutes, the Japanese pilots did the unthinkable. In the gentleman's code of early aviation, you never shot a man in a parachute. But over the skies of Burma, the rules of war had been burned away. The Oscars began to circle the helpless Americans. Owen watched in horror as one of his crew members was cut to pieces by machine gun fire while swinging in his harness. The Japanese pilots were strafing the survivors. Owen knew he was next. He saw a Japanese fighter bank hard, its engine growling as it lined up for a kill run on his position. He was a sitting duck, suspended in midair, with nowhere to hide. The instinct of the 45. Owen Baggett wasn't a man who accepted defeat. As the Japanese plane approached, he did something purely instinctive. He reached for the leather holster on his hip. Inside was a standard issue M-19-11, a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. It was a weapon designed for trench warfare and close-quarters defense. It had a short barrel and a heavy kick. Against a fighter plane traveling at over 200 miles per hour, it was practically a toy. But as the Oscar slowed down to finish him, the pilot literally opening his canopy to mock the dying American, Owen played dead. He went limp in his harness, his head lolling to the side, hiding the pistol against his leg. He waited for the sound of the engine to get louder. He waited for the kill zone. One shot at 15,000 feet, the Japanese pilot was arrogant. He flew his plane within feet of Owen's parachute, slowing down to nearly a stall to watch the American suffer. Owen saw the pilot's face. He saw the goggles. He saw the sneer. In one explosive motion, Owen Baggett snapped his arm up. He didn't aim with his eyes, he aimed with his soul. He emptied the magazine of his .45 caliber pistol into the open cockpit of the Japanese fighter. 4 rounds. Then the slide locked back. The Oscar didn't explode. It didn't catch fire. It simply shuddered. The nose of the plane dipped. The wings began to wobble. Owen watched as the fighter drifted away, spiraling toward the jungle floor below. Against all odds, in the middle of a war of giants, a man with a handgun had just challenged a fighter jet and won. The legend begins Owen Baggett hit the ground minutes later, landing in the dense Burmese jungle. He would spend the next 2 years as a prisoner of war. For a long time, the story was treated as a tall tale. People didn't believe it. They said a pistol couldn't down a plane. They said the physics were impossible. But as we will see in the next chapter, the jungle doesn't keep secrets forever. The wreckage was found, the pilot was found, and the world was forced to acknowledge the impossible shot. The air was thin, the odds were 0. But Owen Baggett had 1 round left. Part 3. The Jungle Trap. The transition from 15,000 feet to the jungle floor is a journey from the infinite to the intimate. For Owen Baggett, the descent was a blur of white silk and green canopy. One moment he was a god of the air, clutching a smoking .45 caliber pistol. The next he was a man-shaped weight crashing through layers of teak trees and tangled vines. His parachute snagged on a massive branch, leaving him dangling 30 feet above the ground. The humid air of Burma hit him like a physical wall. It was thick, hot, and smelled of rotting vegetation. The silence of the jungle was even more terrifying than the roar of the Japanese engines. Owen reached for his survival knife and hacked at the cords. He fell the final few feet, landing hard in the mud. He was alive. He had done the impossible. But now he was deep behind enemy lines, and the Japanese army was already closing in. The hunter becomes the hunted. Owen's first instinct was to move. He knew that the white silk hanging in the trees was a giant signal fire for every Japanese patrol in the area. He checked his equipment. He still had his main 1911 pistol, but the magazine was empty. He had used his last rounds to take down a fighter plane. He fumbled with his gear, sliding a fresh magazine into the grip. The click-clack of the slide chambering around was the only comfort he had. He began to push through the undergrowth, searching for the rest of his crew. He hoped to find Lloyd Jensen, his pilot, or any of the other 9 men who had jumped from the crew's second chance. But the jungle is a labyrinth. The heat began to sap his strength. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Every shadow looked like a Japanese soldier. Owen was no longer the aggressor. He was a lone survivor in a world that wanted him dead. The meeting in the shadows. After hours of trekking through the dense brush, Owen finally spotted another human figure. It wasn't a Japanese soldier, it was one of his crew members. They gathered in a small clearing, their faces masked by exhaustion and shock. They whispered about the attack. They spoke of the men who didn't make it. But when Owen told them what he had done, that he had fired his pistol at a Japanese pilot and watched the plane go down, the reaction was one of disbelief. "You did what, Owen?" In the heat of the jungle, the story sounded insane. How could a .45 caliber bullet bring down a machine made of steel and aluminum? But Owen knew what he had seen. He had seen the pilot's head jerk. He had seen the Oscar lose its soul. But there was no time for stories. The sound of dogs barking and voices shouting in Japanese began to echo through the trees. The trap was closing. The moment of capture, the end of Owen's freedom, came at the edge of a small village. He and his crewmates were surrounded by a superior force of Japanese infantry. There were no heroics left. There were no bullets to spare. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and physically broken. Owen Baggett stood with his hands raised. A Japanese officer stepped forward, his eyes full of cold curiosity. They were stripped of their weapons, their watches, and their dignity. As Owen was marched away, he looked back toward the sky where he had made his stand. To the Japanese, he was just another eagle with clipped wings. They didn't know that this prisoner had already committed an act of defiance that would haunt their air force for decades. They threw him into a makeshift wooden cage. The impossible shot was over. The long dark night of the prisoner of war camps was about to begin. The ghost in the camp, the Japanese soldiers began to talk. Rumors started to spread through the local units about a pilot who had gone down in a mysterious crash during the strafing run. The Japanese didn't tell Owen anything. They interrogated him for hours, asking about bomber formations and base locations. They beat him when he didn't answer. But Owen stayed silent about the pistol. He didn't know if the pilot had survived. He didn't know if he would be executed if he told the truth. He sat in the filth of the prison pen, nursing his wounds, and remembered the face of the pilot in the Oscar. He realized that while he was a prisoner of the Japanese were now prisoners of a mystery they couldn't solve. The man who shot down a plane with a pistol was now a ghost in a cage. The sky was gone. The jungle had swallowed him. But the legend of Owen Baggett was just beginning to grow. Part 4. The Iron Cage. The sky was a memory. The .45 caliber pistol was gone. For Owen Baggett, the war had shrunk from the vast horizons of Burma to the four walls of a concrete cell. In 1943, being a prisoner of the Japanese Empire was often considered a fate worse than death. Owen and the survivors of his crew were transported to Rangoon Jail, a place designed to break the body and erase the soul. He had gone from being a pilot, the elite of the United States Army Air Forces, to a number. He was stripped, beaten, and fed a handful of rotten rice twice a day. The heat in the cells was suffocating, and the diseases malaria, dysentery, and beriberi were more dangerous than any Japanese fighter plane. But Owen Baggett carried something with him that the guards couldn't take away. He carried the secret of the impossible shot. In the silence of the night, as the other prisoners groaned in pain, Owen remembered the face of the Japanese pilot. He remembered the Oscar spiraling toward the jungle. That memory was his armor. The interrogation of the ghost, the Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai, were obsessed with information. They knew that a B-24 Liberator had gone down, but their reports showed something unusual. One of their pilots, a veteran of the 64th Sentai, had crashed in the same area without a single hole from a machine gun in his aircraft. Owen was interrogated repeatedly. The guards wanted to know what new technology the Americans were using. They suspected the B-24 had a secret weapon, or perhaps a hidden sniper. Owen stayed silent. He knew that if he told the truth, that he had shot a pilot with a handgun while hanging from a parachute, they would likely execute him out of pure humiliation. The Japanese Bushido Code could not accept that an American prisoner had defeated a divine warrior of the sky with a simple pistol. Owen became a master of the blank stare. He was a ghost in the machine, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with his captors. Every day he survived was another victory over the Empire. The legend spreads even in the most brutal camps. Information is like water. It finds a way through the cracks. Whispers began to circulate among the American and British prisoners. They heard about a pilot who had taken a wild shot in the air. They heard about a Japanese plane that fell out of a clear sky for no reason. The story gave the men hope. In a place where they were treated like animals, the idea that one of their own had challenged a fighter plane and won was a psychological lifeline. It reminded them that the Japanese were not invincible. It reminded them that even when you are hanging by a thread, you can still fight back. Owen didn't brag. He didn't tell the story to everyone. He kept his head down and worked in the labor details, helping his fellow prisoners survive. He became a leader in the shadows, a man whose quiet strength kept others from giving up. The slow burn of survival months turned into years. 1943 became 1944. Then 1945, Owen watched men die every day. He watched the camp get smaller as the Allied air raids began to hammer Rangoon. Ironically, the same B-24s he once flew were now dropping bombs on the docks nearby. Owen would look up at the silver dots in the sky and smile. He knew the tide was turning. He was starving. His weight had dropped to nearly half of what it was when he bailed out. His skin was yellow from jaundice, but his mind remained focused. He memorized every detail of his fight in the air. He rehearsed the physics of the shot over and over again. He was determined to live, if only to tell the world that it really happened. He was no longer just a pilot. He was the guardian of a miracle. The liberation of the damned. In the summer of 1945, the guards suddenly became nervous. The food stopped coming altogether. The beatings increased, then abruptly stopped. One morning, the prisoners woke up to find the gates of Rangoon jail standing open. The Japanese had fled. Owen Baggett, barely able to stand, walked out into the sunlight. He was a skeleton in a tattered flight suit. But as he looked at the sky, the same sky where he had fired those 4 fateful rounds, he knew he had won. He hadn't just survived the crash. He had survived the Empire. He was rescued by British forces and eventually flown back to the United States. He was going home. But the impossible shot was about to follow him. The world was finally ready to hear the truth. The mystery remains when Owen returned. His story was met with a mix of awe and skepticism. High-ranking officers in the Air Force were fascinated. They had heard the rumors, but they needed proof. Owen gave his report. He described the Oscar, the open canopy, and the .45 caliber rounds. He didn't ask for a medal. He just wanted it on the record. But the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. To prove the shot, they needed to find the plane. They needed to find the pilot. They needed to bridge the gap between an American's memory and a Japanese reality. The impossible shot was about to become an international investigation. The cage was open. The pilot was free. But the legend of Owen Baggett was just reaching its crescendo. Part 5, The Final Proof. When Owen Baggett returned to the United States in late 1945, he was a man between two worlds. He was a hero who had survived the brutal labor camps of Burma, but he was also the author of a story that seemed to defy the laws of physics. To many, the idea that a man hanging from a parachute could shoot down a Japanese Oscar with a .45 caliber pistol was a war myth, the kind of story born from trauma and the thin air of high altitude. Even within the Army Air Forces there were skeptics, but Owen wasn't looking for a medal. He simply wanted the truth to stand. As the dust of World War II settled, a massive effort began to catalog the wreckage of thousands of planes scattered across the jungles of Southeast Asia. Intelligence officers began to translate captured Japanese documents. And in the middle of those files, they found a ghost. The impossible shot was about to receive its final, undeniable proof. The captured records. The first breakthrough came from the records of the Japanese 64th Sentai, the elite fighter unit that had attacked Owen's bomber. Japanese reports from March 31, 1943, confirmed a strange and tragic loss. One of their pilots, a young man who had been strafing American parachutists, never returned to base. His wingman reported seeing his plane suddenly bank and dive for no apparent reason. There were no Allied fighters in the area. There were no anti-aircraft batteries on the ground. Most importantly, the Japanese report noted that the plane did not show signs of combat damage from heavy machine guns. It had simply fallen. When the wreckage was later located in the Burmese jungle, investigators found a shocking detail. The pilot had been shot in the head. The bullet had entered through the open canopy. It wasn't a 20mm cannon shell or a .50 caliber round. It was a small, slow-moving lead slug. The physics matched. The timing matched. The impossible shot had found its target. The official recognition. For years, Owen's story was passed around flight lounges and veterans bars. But in the 1950s and 60s, the Air Force Association and military historians began to take a formal look at the incident. They analyzed the stall speed of the K-43 Oscar. They calculated the relative velocity of a falling parachutist. They realized that for a few seconds, Owen Baggett and the Japanese pilot were effectively stationary in relation to each other. The United States Air Force officially recognized the event. Owen Baggett became a legend, not just for surviving the camps, but for performing an act of defiance that redefined what a soldier could do with a sidearm. Owen stayed in the Air Force, eventually rising to the rank of colonel. He was a man of quiet dignity, often downplaying the event by saying, "I just did what I had to do." But to every pilot who ever strapped on a flight suit, Owen Baggett was the man who proved that you are never truly out of the fight. The legacy of the M1911. The weapon Owen used, the M-19-11, already had a legendary reputation, but Baggett's shot turned it into a myth. The .45 caliber pistol was designed for stopping power in the jungles of the Philippines at the turn of the century. It was never meant to be an anti-aircraft weapon. But Owen's story became the ultimate testament to the reliability and power of the American sidearm. Gun collectors and historians still talk about the Baggett shot whenever the M1911 is mentioned. It serves as a reminder that a weapon is only as effective as the man behind the trigger. In the hands of a pilot who refused to die, a simple handgun became a giant killer, the final sunset. Owen Baggett lived a long and full life, passing away in 2006 at the age of 85. He lived to see his story published in books, magazines, and historical journals. He lived to see the Japanese and the Americans become allies. He lived to see the world move from propellers to jet engines and into the space age. But every time he looked at the sky, he surely remembered those few seconds at 15,000 feet. He remembered the snap of the silk, the crack of the pistol, and the sight of the Oscar diving away. He was the man who challenged the machine. He was the man who shot the sky. Conclusion: the human factor. The story of Owen Baggett is more than just a lucky shot. It is a story about the human spirit in the face of absolute despair. It tells us that no matter how high the odds are stacked against us, no matter if we are hanging by a thread or locked in a cage, we always have a choice. We can be victims or we can be fighters. Owen Baggett chose to fight. He chose to aim. And in doing so, he left a mark on history that will never be erased. The impossible shot was real. The pilot was real. And the legend is eternal. The flight is over. The mission is complete. Part 6. The Echo of the .45. History is often written in broad strokes: the movement of armies, the dropping of massive bombs, the decisions of kings and presidents. But every once in a while, history narrows down to a single point. A single man. A single bullet. The story of Owen Baggett and his 15,000-foot shot has moved beyond the realm of war story and into the realm of military legend. But for the skeptics who still ask, how? And for the historians who ask, why? The answers lie in a perfect storm of ballistics, psychology, and pure, unadulterated American defiance. Today, as we close the book on the impossible shot, we look at the echo it left behind. We look at how a .45 caliber handgun became the most famous anti-aircraft weapon in history, and why the name Owen Baggett still makes every pilot standing on a flight line stand a little bit taller. The ballistic miracle. Physics in the void. To understand why Owen Baggett succeeded where 1,000 others would have failed, we have to look at the math of the moment. The M1911 pistol fires a 230-grain lead slug. It is a slow, heavy bullet, traveling at roughly 825 feet per second. In a normal dogfight, this bullet would be useless. It would be like trying to throw a rock at a passing jet. But at 15,000 feet, in the thin air of Burma, everything changed. Because the Japanese pilot had slowed his Oscar fighter to the point of a near stall to mock the parachutists, the relative wind was minimized. Owen Baggett wasn't shooting at a plane moving at 300 miles per hour. He was shooting at a target that was relative to him, almost stationary. Ballistic experts have noted that at a range of less than 10 feet, the muzzle energy of a .45 caliber round is over 350 foot-pounds. That is more than enough to shatter a plexiglass canopy and penetrate a flight helmet. Owen didn't need to be a super sniper. He just needed to be a cool-headed soldier who knew his weapon's limits. The psychology of the dead man. The greatest weapon Owen Baggett possessed that day wasn't the pistol in his hand. It was the deception in his mind. In military theory, we call this asymmetric psychological warfare. By playing dead, Owen stripped the Japanese pilot of his combat focus. The pilot stopped being a warrior and became a tourist. He lowered his guard, opened his canopy, and drifted into the kill zone of a man he thought was a corpse. This is the eternal lesson of Owen Baggett. The enemy is most vulnerable when he believes he has already won. The Japanese Bushido code emphasized victory and honor, but it often led to a dangerous level of arrogance. The pilot of the 64th Sentai didn't just lose a dogfight. He lost his life to a ghost. The psychological blow resonated throughout the Japanese Air Force units in Burma. It taught them that an American soldier is never more dangerous than when he is down to his last round. The M1911, the American icon. You cannot tell the story of Owen Baggett without telling the story of the 45. Designed by John Browning and adopted by the Army in 1911, this pistol was built for one thing: stopping power. It was the weapon of the trenches in World War I and the weapon of the jungles in the Pacific. But after March 31st, 1943, the M1911 became something more. It became a symbol of the last line of defense. Every American pilot since then has looked at the survival holster on their vest with a new level of respect. They know that if the engines fail, if the wings break, and if the parachute is the only thing between them and the earth, they are still armed. They still have a say in how the story ends. The Baggett shot validated the American philosophy of individual lethality. It proved that every soldier, regardless of their primary job, is first and foremost a rifleman, or in this case, a pistolier. The final verdict of the 64th Sentai years after the war. Researchers digging through the archives of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force found fragments of interviews with surviving mechanics and pilots from the Burma campaign. While the official records were sparse, the oral history of the unit confirmed a sense of shame regarding the loss of a pilot during a strafing run. The Japanese referred to it as an unfortunate encounter with a determined enemy. They didn't want to admit a handgun did the work, but they couldn't deny the single-entry wound found in the recovered pilot's remains. To the Japanese, Owen Baggett wasn't just a lucky survivor. He was a demon of the air. This respect, born from a moment of absolute violence, is the highest honor a warrior can receive from his enemy. Owen Baggett didn't just kill a pilot. He earned the eternal respect of an empire. The end of the impossible today. The B-24 Liberators are gone. The Ki-43 Oscars are museum pieces. The jungles of Burma have reclaimed the wreckage of the crew's second chance. But the story of Owen Baggett remains as sharp as a .45 caliber slug. It reminds us that the impossible is just a word used by people who haven't tried yet. It tells us that gravity is just a suggestion when you have enough grit. And it proves that a man with a handgun and a parachute can take on a fighter plane and win. Owen Baggett was a colonel, a prisoner of war, and a pilot. But above all, he was the man who shot the sky. The mission is over. The legend is forever. Part 2. The Predator's Mistake. At 15,000 feet, the world is supposed to be quiet. For Owen Baggett, dangling in his harness after his B-24 Liberator exploded, the silence was terrifying. He was suspended between heaven and earth, watching the black smoke of his bomber drift toward the Burmese jungle. But the silence didn't last. The Japanese pilots of the 64th Sentai were not finished. In the early years of the war, there was an unwritten rule. You do not fire on a man in a parachute. It was considered murder, not combat. But on this morning in March 1943, the gentleman's code was dead. One by one, the Nakajima Ki-43 fighters known as Oscars began to dive. Owen watched as his pilot Lloyd Jensen was targeted. He saw the tracers, bright, glowing lines of lead sowing a path across the sky. The Japanese Predator had stopped hunting planes. He was now hunting people. And Owen Baggett was the next name on the list. The arrogance of the ace, the Japanese pilot who targeted Owen Baggett, was likely a veteran. He was flying one of the most maneuverable planes in the world. He had total air superiority. To him, the American hanging from the silk canopy wasn't a threat, he was a trophy. This was the Predator's mistake: arrogance. The pilot didn't stay at a distance and use his machine guns. He wanted to see his work. He wanted to look the American in the eye as he died. He throttled back his engine, dropped his flaps, and slowed the Oscar down to the point where it was almost hovering in the thin air. He was flying so slowly and so close that the prop wash from his fighter began to buffet Owen's parachute, causing him to swing wildly. The pilot was close enough for Owen to see the silk scarf around his neck. He was close enough to see the pilot laughing. Playing the only card left, Owen Baggett knew he couldn't outrun a bullet. He couldn't hide in the open sky. So he did the only thing a man can do when he is outmatched. He played dead. He let his body go limp. He tucked his chin to his chest. He let his arms hang down like broken wings. He became a corpse in the clouds. Through his squinted eyes, Owen watched the Japanese pilot fall for the trap. The Oscar circled back, even closer this time. The pilot was curious. He wanted to confirm the kill. He opened his cockpit canopy, a fatal move to get a better look at the dead American. But beneath Owen's limp right arm, his hand was already gripping the checkered walnut stock of his M-19-11. He had thumbed the safety off. He had a round in the chamber. He was no longer a victim. He was an ambush waiting to happen. The physics of a miracle to hit a moving plane with a handgun is statistically impossible. But at this moment, the math was shifting. Because the Japanese pilot had slowed down to nearly a stall speed to mock Owen, the relative velocity between the two was almost zero. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the fighter plane and the parachute were stationary in relation to each other. Owen waited. He waited until the cockpit of the Oscar was less than 10 feet away. He could see the oil stains on the engine cowling. He could see the rivets on the fuselage. He didn't wait for a signal. He didn't say a word. He simply snapped his body upright, raised the heavy iron sights of the .45, and unleashed the fury of an American soldier who refused to die. The crack in the sky, the sound of an M1911 firing at 15,000 feet, is a sharp, lonely snap. Owen emptied the magazine. He fired as fast as his finger could pull the trigger. Pop, 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 pop. He saw the heavy .45 caliber slugs punch through the glass of the open canopy. He saw the Japanese pilot's head jerk back. The laughter vanished. The Oscar suddenly lost its grace. The engine roared as the pilot's dead weight slumped onto the throttle, and the plane banked sharply to the left, diving toward the green abyss below. In the middle of the sky, Owen Baggett stood alone in his harness, his pistol smoking, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just done the one thing no flight manual said was possible. He had shot down a fighter plane with a handgun. The long fall to earth Owen didn't celebrate. He knew the other Japanese pilots were still in the area. He quickly hid the pistol back in its holster and resumed his dead pose, drifting down for another 10 minutes until he hit the trees. He had survived the air, but he was now in the heart of enemy territory. He was alone, his crew was scattered, and the Japanese army was hunting for the man who had just embarrassed their elite air force. The impossible shot was over. Now the impossible escape was about to begin. The pilot was dead. The plane was gone. But for Owen Baggett, the war was just getting started.